All right, so last topic and probably shortest lecture videos here for you. I know we're at the end of the term and almost done, so I'm not going to, keep you too long here in the videos. But we're looking at the rather big topic of collective behavior and social movements here. And it kind of comes at the end because you've been looking at sociology and how sociology looks at society and human experiences and everything. And we've just been, orienting ourselves to some of the major concepts and that sort of thing. Sometimes, though, human behavior and group interactions become so widespread that we need to kind of really broaden out our look and look at not only how people act, and many people act in similar ways and in pattern ways, so collective behavior, but also really influential, outcomes of social movements, which is a form of collective behavior here. Now, I will just remind you that there's an introductory, another introductory questions for you in Brightspace. And if I can quickly remember how to switch over and allow, here we go. And so with this particular topic, I couldn't decide on just one question or one introduction to this topic. So I picked three. Two of them, I'll speak to here in the lecture video. I'll talk about crowd behavior for the first question. The other one is about social movements and social issues. I'll talk about those. I'm not going to talk about technologies, but there is a really interesting section in the chapter, online tech chapter for that part. So this one, you can pick one, you can pick them all. As always, these questions are just to get you to try and personalize some of the information in this topic this week, and which is hopefully helps you remember and learn this information when it comes time to doing your test. All right, so let's start in on collective behavior. Collective behavior is defined as activities involving a large number of people. Often they're spontaneous, and usually the behavior operates in violation of some established norms. This is one way that collective behavior is different from social groups, which we looked at in the previous topic. Conventional cultural norms usually regulate the behavior of social group members, but some collective behaviors, where they govern the behavior of social group members. When we're looking at collective behavior, though, some definitely will follow conventional norms, but other collective forms of collective behavior will develop decidedly unconventional or even deviant norms. And so that what makes them a little bit different than social groups. The collective behavior we're looking at in this topic is also different from the behavior of the typical social group, because collective behavior is often based on limited social interactions, so limited time-wise. The collective behaviors happens really quickly and then it dies off, or it's limited in that it happens only in one small place and that sort of thing. Another way that collective behavior is different from social groups is that collectivities often have no clear social boundaries. They might have a common object of attention, but members of the collectivity don't have a strong sense of unity or coherence beyond that immediate and that short time-wise activity that they're engaging in. So we have different types of collective behavior. And these are all covered in the textbook, so more definition and examples of them are in the textbook. Fairly straightforward. I'll challenge you to add in your own examples of each of these in terms of how you've experienced each of these. So for instance, crowd behavior. So a crowd is defined as a temporary gathering of people who share a common focus of attention and whose behavior might influence one another. And Little goes through different types of crowds, a casual crowd, a conventional crowd, expressive crowd, and an acting crowd. So try and see if you can identify some types of crowds that you might have been a part of. Another type of collective behavior is a mob. Sounds really cool. A mob is a highly emotional crowd that pursues often, but not exclusively, a violent or destructive goal. Little actually talks about flash mobs, and those are not violent, those are not destructive, but they are definitely, they fit the definition of being a highly emotional crowd. Typically, historically, mobs have been violent, have been destructive. The flash mob, like a bunch of people coming together to do a choreographed dance routine of strangers. That's a little bit more of a recent development. Mass is another form of collective behavior. Mass is collective behavior among people dispersed over a wide geographical area. So people are not physically in the same space, but they're engaging in the same and similar behavior. They typically, a mass behavior involves people responding to the same event in a similar way. And so really the classic example of a mass behavior is using the example of mass hysteria or mass panic. And a really specific example of that was the mass panic that arose after that is associated with a radio broadcast of H.G. Wells's book, The War of the Worlds. So in 1938, the radio station in the U.S. was giving doing a dramatization of the book, reading the book and presenting it as a drama, so fiction, and it's a fictional book over the radio, and tons of millions of listeners heard it. Of the around 10 million listeners of the War of the Worlds dramatization, around 1 million of them reportedly missed the announcement at the beginning of the broadcast, missed the announcement that this was fiction, that this was not real. And so by the time the show was over, then thousands of people were hysterical. They gathered in the streets to spread the news of this invasion of aliens, while others flooded telephone switchboards with warnings to friends and relatives that were being invaded. Many people jumped into their cars and tried to flee. So a panic is and this fits this definition of mass behavior. A panic is a form of localized collective behavior where people are reacting to something with irrational, frantic, and often self-destructive behavior. And so other examples of mass panic would be things like people responding to the word fire being shouted in a crowded building. People would flee in fear, and we do know that they do flee in fear. They trample one another, block exits, and that sort of thing. Now, another type of a collective behavior is public or public opinion. I kind of like public opinion better. I believe Little just refers to it as public, but what he's referring to is public opinion. So public opinion is widespread political attitudes and beliefs that are communicated by ordinary citizens to decision makers. So that's like you voting is an expression of public behavior, public opinion behavior, or responding to polls, or writing letters to the editor of newspapers, or expressing themselves online about political matters. That would be a form of public collective behavior. Now, there is another category of collective behavior, and that is social movements. And so we'll look at those separately, though, here, but I wanted to just remind you that that is another form of collective behavior, but it is much more complex and involved than these forms of collective behavior. When we're just looking at these forms of collective behavior, we kind of, sociologists always want to know why. Why do things happen? How do they happen the way they do? So we do have explanations here and attempts to answer the question, what causes people to act collectively? Collective behavior, though, is hard to study because often it's quite transitory. For instance, since riots or panics or even a flash mob, tend to arise and dissipate quickly, they're really difficult to investigate systematically. Sociologists can anticipate some gatherings, some forms of collective behavior. So, for example, a crowd that forms at a sports event or concert. But there's no one single theory that ties together all of those different types of actions that fall under that umbrella of collective behavior. So we have a few different theories that will work in some cases as a good explanation, and in other cases, not so much. So let's see. Yeah, so I'm not going to cover these theories here. Again, I only do that when I really like the online text and Little's definition and how he walks you through each of these perspectives with some good examples. So you'll have to take a look at those. And again, if you've gone back and thought of some examples of how you've been involved in crowd behavior or mob behavior, hopefully not mob behavior, or just examples that of mob behavior you're aware of, mass behavior and public opinion. See if any of, for those examples, if any of these explanations for how those behaviors come into being make sense to you. Okay, I'm going to spend more time though talking about social movements. So again, another type of collective behavior. There are though the most complex type of collective behavior. So we need to sort of explore them in a little bit more detail. Now, a really simple definition of a social movement is something that people create to press for social change. So a social movement is a sustained conscious attempt of crowds and masses of people to bring about change in the social structure through collective action. So a social movement typically has 4 key features. These are absent in the other forms of collective behavior. So that's what makes social movements unique. So first, social movements seek change through disrupting the social order. Social movements are attempts to alter some hierarchical arrangement within society. This typically involves demands by a disadvantaged group for change to the status quo to improve their material circumstances. So, for example, to try and redistribute some of the resources or power within society. So that could be wealth. I'm forgetting now the timeline, but there was the Occupy movement several years ago where the social movement activity was trying to called attention to how wealth was distributed in the 1% of people in society, whereas the 99% were low income, middle income, and powerless. Other resources trying to seek to distribute wealth, power, property, opportunities. The women's movement as a social movement was about not only distributing wealth and power, but also opportunities for women in the workplace and in society more general. They were trying to make social life more equal between men and women in that regard. access to basic civil rights would also be a way to disrupt the social order, to give more rights to more groups of people. So the Black Civil Rights Movement of the US, the Indigenous rights movement here in Canada would be examples of that. Another feature of social movements is that social movements are marked by networks, or the interaction of many individuals, groups, and organizations. So this is truly collective action. Collective action is much more powerful than individual action or individual activity. Hence the saying, there's strength in numbers. And this is because, for one, many voices are louder and more noticeable than an individual voice. Secondly, the strength in numbers, because with collective action, you have networks of people working together, and you have the pooling of resources that are essential for action and for actually maybe even succeeding in disrupting that social order. And one of the theories we'll look at here will detail some of what sorts of resources are needed to have an effective social movement, but essentially they are, essential resources for action are things like information, expertise, knowledge, finances, people to build your movement on. Another feature of social movements are that social movements are typically driven by individuals who are outsiders to the dominant political, social, or cultural mainstream. Essentially people who are excluded from or marginalized within the dominant institutions within society. And that is, the reason for number one here for disrupting the social order, to make them more insiders versus outsiders. And lastly, social movements are maybe distinguished from other political actions or public crowds because of their adoption of unusual patterns of political behavior, or deviant patterns of political behavior. So, for example, social movements often use protest, doing protests or strikes. That's deviant form of public behavior. More normal or non-deviant forms, conventional styles of political participation are things like voting or lobbying political representatives. So because those normal and typical forms of political behavior haven't worked for the members of these outsider members of the social movements, they have to adopt deviant patterns, and they have to adopt some non-traditional ways to try and express their movement. So because of number three here, because groups are made up of outsiders, social movements, they're outside the political mainstream, so they lack the power and the resources to bring change about in their favor. So organizing in a group, acting collectively, often offers these outsiders an opportunity to have their voices heard and actually affect change that they seek. So social movements, therefore, are purposeful, they're goal-oriented, they're structured, they involve large numbers of people working together with shared ideas and an agreed upon strategy. And most importantly, that goal that they have is significant social change. Either change in the way people see themselves and their work, change in the way people behave toward one another and relate to one another, or change in that distribution and of resources or even just opportunities within society. So, as usual, we have different types of social movements, and typically the way that social movements are, we sort of categorize different social movements is usually in terms of how much change that they are trying to seek, or what type of change. And so this is right from the online textbook, and they've given you some really good examples here of each of these types of change. I won't necessarily repeat any of this, because again, I like his definitions here. And so this would be a good, tested, given that one introductory question about, if you think about a cause or social issue that's important for you, is that tied to a social movement? And if so, does it fit any of these particular definitions of a social movement? Now, we also, as you know, we like to explain things in sociology. So, we kind of want to know, and we have studied, why do social movements happen? Why do they begin? So we have a few different explanations for social movement activities. I'm going to talk about, a little does not talk about some of the early theories of social movement, but I do want to raise it. It's not a dominant theory today, but there's elements of it, and I would like, you to have this information. There's elements of it in some dominant social movements today. So, but overall, early attempts to explain social movements or collective behavior, they treated social movements largely as irrational responses of alienated individuals to some sort of social strain or social breakdown. And in this way, the collective actions and responses of people were defined more so as threats to the established ruling order. And so they tended to be dismissed as like crowd-like, emotional, or deviant, or even criminalized as a way to try and control the people and stop the threat to social change. And these would be defined, I'm meaning that by the governments or those who were being called to make a change. So for example, we had the relative deprivation theory. It was a typical theory and it was dominant for a while. Again, it still exists a little bit today. But there's the notion within the relative deprivation theory, the notion was that social movements will arise among people who feel deprived, and it's a relative deprivation. So it's a perception of, it might not actually be accurate, but when a person sort of compares themselves to others, by comparison, they feel deprived, and that then is a trigger for attempting to try and change and reduce that deprivation. So people who feel they lack sufficient income or important political rights or satisfactory working conditions, these were seen as examples of frustrated expectations, which would then lead them to aggressive behavior. That dissatisfaction provoked feelings of restlessness and the urge to do something to change the offending situation. Now, there were problems, though, with that definition and that understanding of a social movement behavior. For one, it didn't explain why social movements emerge among certain categories of people, but not others, even if, certain, groups that were legitimately, unequal and disadvantaged, so sometimes social movements wouldn't arise. And so it didn't really consistently capture what was happening or not happening. Problems, social injustices have always existed, but only certain conditions are protested and not even those all the time. And secondly, when talking about some of the really big social movements of the 1970s here in North America, the relative deprivation theory didn't work at all. So some of the big social movements of the 1970s were things like the student movement. So university students, protesting, and, they were university students, and they were challenging kind of, governments and the traditional organization of life. But because they were university students, they were wealthy and they had money to go to university. So that sense of deprivation just didn't exist there. So, but other social movements at that time were things like the anti-Vietnam War or broader peace movement. The environmental movement started in the 1970s. The women's movement, or at least the second wave of the women's movement, was then, and the gay and lesbian rights movement also started then. And those movements, when we look at them, they were made up mostly of middle class people. So they were not economically disadvantaged. So they didn't fit as nicely into theories like the relative deprivation theory. So additional theories needed to be created, and they were. So we see the creation of, and Little covers these, the resource mobilization theory, the framing theory, and new social movement theory. So again, Little has good explanations. I'll just add in a little bit more information on each of these as well. So please read this along, or take these notes in alongside what Little tells you about these theories. So we'll start with the resource mobilization theory. This theory says that social movements will develop as a function of how resources are brought together and then utilized in effort to affect some sort of social change. There's different types of resources. So there are, my pen here, there are moral resources. So this would be kind of the strength and the legitimacy of the cause of the movement, and how much you can get other people to see, yes, that's a very important issue. Cultural resources. So this is the know-how of how to effectively try and press for social change. Social organizational resources. This would be things like making sure there's groups that you can network together, and networks of groups, and bringing that all together. Human resources. You need people. It's a social movement, so you need volunteers, you need leaders, you need workers of the movement to help sustain it. And then material resources. So these are things like finances and funding, as well as potentially either office space or, internet, websites and that sort of thing, anything to sort of get your message out there. And so the resource mobilization theory really studies the process by which members gather, trade, use, and occasionally waste resources as they seek to advance a cause. Part of this theory also, a key resource is often you'll see members of one social movement networking and connecting with members of another social movement, just to increase those resources, increase the strength of the cause. So for example, you often see when we think about workers' movements, and we can link up unions, and so many workers are part of a union, and the whole purpose for union activity is to promote the interests of and promote good working conditions for members of their union in their workplaces. But often unions will then show solidarity and support to other movements. So for example, starting in the 1970s, during that second wave of the women's movement, but then continuing even to today, we see unions also supporting women's movement or feminist movement activity in terms of standing up and dealing with violence or domestic violence or violence against women within society. So they kind of join and intersect forces there, two different movements, gender-based movements and union work-based movements in that example. All right, frame alignment theory is the second theory, and let's see. This is as Little tells you, this is a symbolic interactionist theory, the social constructionist approach in particular here. And this theory really lays out an essential process that social movements have to go through, in that they have to frame the issue, the cause, in a particular way, so that when they're communicating that to not only those people who have the power to try and affect change, but also to the broader public in an effort to try and get more people to join the movement. So they have to, the frame alignment is about framing how you talk about the issue to get that support that you need. It's also really important to frame the issue to create a shared understanding and a shared view of this is the problem and this is how we fix it. And so that also feeds into members of the social movement come to adopt a collective identity. It becomes, part of who they are as individuals. So that strengthens their commitment to the movement. They feel, this is essential to their existence here. And so what the theory does is using that symbolic interaction as, those concepts there, there's a very, concerted effort to symbolically present the problem to participants and the general public. With this theory, so the social movement is seen as an interactive, symbolically defined and negotiated process that involves participants, opponents, and bystanders in it. Then a little walks you through some of the different steps or the process of frame alignment here. And this is, if you remember Irving Goffman from the dramaturgical approach earlier in the course, this is another Irving Goffman concept here, this frame alignment. And this is just frame analysis refers to our interpretation of the particulars of events and activities as dependent upon the framework from which we perceive. And this framing process helps transition individual views into a shared one that then becomes part of that collective identity. So again, I'll let Little tell you about the framing process, but there's these steps where you start with frame bridging, frame amplification, frame extension, and frame transformation. So taking a look at kind of what might be a little bit involved in each of those. Then the last theory we have here is the new social movement theory. And I kind of already touched on that earlier. As I said, during the 1970s, there was a whole host of social movements. I listed all of them. Some other ones that also happened at that time that were just not, they didn't have theories yet to really understand why they came into being. But another movement at that time was the sexual revolution happened at that time. There was also the hippie movement at that time. And so women's movement, gay and lesbian rights movement, environmentalist movement, hippie movement, these were all new social movements. And what they shared in common was identity, personal individual identity became the source of collective action and social movement. And so with the women's movement in particular, that was all about trying to change the definition and the expectations about what it was to be a woman in those societies at that time, to broaden it out and to make it more equal or similar to that of men. And that was, what informs individual gender identity. So trying to sort of shift that, and that became the basis for that particular movement. Same thing with environmental justice movements. And that even continues, here today. More recently, there's been a lot of really interesting sociological work looking at the intersection of environmental justice movements and with race and class. experiences within the environment struggle, such that actually there's this concept of environmental racism, which is the belief that a disproportionate number of hazardous facilities, like industries and their waste disposal or treatment of chemical plants, how these hazardous facilities are placed in low income areas that are populated by people of color, by racialized groups of individuals. So the negative impacts of these hazardous facilities and hazardous impacts on the environment have a disproportionate impact on low income and racialized groups within our society. And so the environmental justice movement then is about not only trying to save the planet and save the environment, but also to try and affect and stop inequality of the negative impacts and who bears some of the worst effects of environmental injustice and environmental harm. So that's all wrapped up in again that this notion that the social movement contributes to and enhances collective sources of identity within people's experiences there. All right, so that takes us to the end of not only this topic, but this course. There's no journal entry or no journal post for this topic. All you need to do now is your last paper, last exam, last test in the course. And with that, best of luck to you on that test, and best of luck to you in hopefully what are some more sociology classes that you take once you come and are a full-time student of Red Deer Polytechnic.